What I do, traveling around, and I'm in day one of a 2-week tour of Colorado with the Colorado Humanities Council, and my co-worker and my dear friend for a number of years, Mrs. Betty Jo Brenner, and I are traveling the foothills, and we are back for, I think, the 4th time here at this wonderful library in Pueblo.
I want to take you back in time, suspend reality a little bit and pretend that we are in 1877, post-Civil War period. And you are going to meet Frederick Douglass, who is speaking to a public audience about the recent war. So let me introduce Frederick Douglass.
Thank you. And I am indeed glad to spend some time with people who want to spend an hour or so with me. I've spent the better part of my adult life traveling this country, speaking out on issues that are of significance to our country, primarily as an abolitionist and certainly as a speaker for the cause of women's rights. And as a result of that, knowing our recent history, I think you can well understand why I say that the Republican Party is the debt. All else merely the open sea. I say that for 3 reasons. The Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army, and the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution granting black men the right to vote. And each of these milestones can be embodied in the life, the legacy, the memory of the late President Abraham Lincoln. As we all know, when the president came to power, some 17 years ago in 1860, the war had commenced, and the president was quite frank about the purpose of the war from his point of view. This was a war to save the Union. This was not a war to free the slaves. The black man has no part in this war, said he. Well, some of us took issue with that. We thought, with all due respect, Mr. President, unless you free the slaves, there can be no Union. First, you must free the slaves, and then you must arm the freedmen. Well, in due course, military necessity convinced the president of the utility of that admonition, and he issued a proclamation, an executive action, which stated in part that all those who were held in bondage in states in rebellion against the Union as of 1 January 1863 are henceforth and forever free. And then he had one little section in there that said that black men would be allowed to join the Union war effort. I was brought aboard as one of many recruiters, and I started to recruit. I was staying in Rochester at that time, New York still. In fact, my two oldest boys were my first two recruits. Effort went quite well. Then some things began to happen that certain promises were not being kept. And I felt that I was duly bound to resign and protest. So I talked the matter over to Major Stearns. He said, well, Douglas, if you feel that strongly about it, why don't you take it up with the president himself? So I thought, well, why not? So I took transportation over to Washington City. On my way over to Executive Office Building, I ran into an acquaintance of mine, one of the two senators in the state east of here, Kansas, Samuel Pomeroy. I explained my situation to him. He asked if he could accompany me. I said, it'd be an honor. We walked in. There was many people waiting to see the president. I sent out my card, and he saw me, and he started to rise and rise and rise. And all of a sudden, the audacity of me began to dawn on myself. Here I am, a former slave, who takes it upon himself to schedule his own meeting with the president, and I'm afraid I began to babble. I said, pardon me, Mr. President, my name is Frederick Douglass, and he said, I know who you are, Mr. Douglass. Secretary Seward told me all about you when he invited me to sit. I said, well, Your Excellency, I only have 3 brief points I would like to discuss. Pay, protection, and promotion. I said, as you are aware, sir, our effort in recruiting black troops has been quite successful. I said, but sir, it was with the understanding that Negro troops would be paid at the same scale as white troops, but such is not the case. The president listened, was quite deliberate, and I felt a certain type of energy coming from him, and I didn't quite know what was happening. I put it away, and he finally said, well, you know, Mr. Douglas, on this issue of pay, you know, it never was, nor is it a popular measure among whites in the North to even bring Negroes into the Union Army. But we do feel in time this pay issue will be settled, and besides, they have a more noble reason for fighting just for pay. And I've already issued a retaliatory offer about any captured rebel troop, and on this matter of promotion. I will be quite happy to sign off on any promotion the Secretary of War Stanton gives me. He waited to see if I had anything else, and I was well satisfied that this man indeed was on his age. As the Senator and I were walking, I began to contemplate this feeling that I had gotten from him. And it has something to do with how a black man positions himself relative to a white man in this country, vice versa. That is, at no point in our conversation did I get the feeling that the president looked upon himself as a superior speaking to an inferior. He simply received me as one gentleman received another. And I went about my recruiting effort. Of course, now the president had been on record as early as 1854 speaking about his dissatisfaction with slavery. In fact, he said, I hated slavery. Of course, now, I hated slavery too. But I hate it for a little bit different reason, the president. I hate it based on my own personal experience. experience. I was born around the year 1817 as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the Lloyd Plantation in Maryland's eastern shore, a place called Chautauqua. That's Edward Lloyd, one of the richest, most powerful men in the country. You get away from him, you scoundrel. One way from here. I wouldn't have whooped you half as much as I did if you hadn't resisted. You just wrong. Well, during the remaining 6 months that I lived with Kobe, he never laid so much as the weight of his little finger on me again in anger. All he would occasionally say, I don't want to have to put my hands on you again. A declaration I had no difficulty in believing. Well, this little transaction with Kobe, as undignified as it was the turning point in my life as a slave. I'd reached a point at which I was not afraid to fight back. And this spirit made me a free man, in fact, though I remained a slave in form. So, at the beginning of the year, 1837, I took upon myself a solemn vow that the year which had now dawned would not close without witnessing an earnest attempt on my part to gain the freedom. Escape, I eventually did. I was one of those fortunate few who managed to obtain a ticket on that special railroad that extended from Kentucky straight on into Canada. So on a cool Monday morning, the 3rd of September, 1838, in accordance with my previous resolution, I jumped on board and exchanged my bondage for my freedom. My intended wife, Anna Murray, a free woman of color, came up from Baltimore into New York City. We were married, then into the state of Massachusetts, the town of New Bedford. Fine city, New Bedford. Whaling capital, one of the richest cities in America. While running around the city of New Bedford for several months, there came to me a young man with a copy of the Liberator, the paper edited by the great abolitionist William Lord Garrison. From the time I was brought in contact with the mind of Garrison, I not only liked this paper, I loved it, along with its editor. Well, of course, as the war proceeded, they realized that they had not contemplated the real tenacity of the rebel forces. People began to wonder, the president himself, what would happen if the European powers were to intervene? What would happen if our traditional ally of France came aboard? Or if those textile mills in northern England and Manchester began to close down because we couldn't get cotton there because of the naval blockade? Would they intervene? And if they did, would it be on the side of the Union or on the side of their natural trading allies, the South side? Did I meet any girl that was scorned? Why, even the very dogs of old England know that I'm a man. I was attending a meeting at Buckingham. While upon the platform, little dog actually came up there and put his paw right smack dab in the middle of it and gave me a bark of recognition as a man. And I figured in these days of doubt, even a dog's testimony was worth something. I do not return to America to sit still, to remain quiet, and to enjoy a life of ease and comfort. Since I have been in this country, I have been offered house, land, and every inducement to bring my family over here with good and dear people. I prefer living a life of activity in the service of my brother. I choose rather to go home, to return to America. I glory in the conflict that I might hereafter exalt in the victory, and I know that victory is certain. So I go turning my back upon the ease, the comfort, the respectability that I might maintain here, ignorant as I am, still I go back for the sake of my brother. I go to suffer with them, to endure insults with them, to lift up my voice in their behalf, and to speak and write in their vindication for that emancipation which shall yet be achieved by the power of truth and of reason. With these words, I beg to bid all of my friends, those who are here, and those who have departed, farewell. And upon my return to the land of liberty, it was business as usual. And many of the words that I had spoken while abroad, biting, scornful words about this racialist American society came back to bite me. And I make no pretension here. They came from all directions, from friends and foe alike, from black as well as white, from people who believe that a man, and especially a black man, presumes too much when he decides to take the plight of black people before other nations of the world. How dare a black man take it upon himself to experiment in the area of international politics? I understand that, Frederick, but my gosh, boy, what good has it done? Have you not irritated? Have you not annoyed your American friends? Have I not irritated? I don't believe this. Have I not irritated? Yes, Dave, I have irritated them. They deserve to be irritated. I am ever anxious to irritate the American people on this question, Dave, and as it is in physics, so in morals. There are cases which demand irritation and counter-irritation. And I intend to blister it all over from center to circumference. Yes, sir? Oh, yes, sir. My name is Frederick Douglass. What's that you say? America, love it for begun. And we display a grand amount of ingratitude. Like a man who goes into a gentleman's house, accepts his hospitality, and yet abuses his fare, and we have no right to accept gentleman's house and hospitality without due process. So, I see. Here we have it, all reasoned out as plain as logic can make it, the limit of freedom of speech, accurately defined. But allow me to throw a little light upon your logic, sir. Well, a gentleman's house and hospitality and the government of this country are wholly dissimilar. Read your bill of fare. It contains the names of many palatable dishes, so he asks the cook for soup, and he gets dishwater. For duck, he gets dog. For beef, he gets bullfrog. For salt, sand, pepper powder, and for vinegar, he gets gall. In fact, he gets for you the very opposite of everything you asked, and from which the bill of fare you had a right to expect So I can read with pleasure, sir, your Constitution to establish the blessings of liberty and prosperity. Those are indeed precious things to your mind. But when I remember that an aged grandmother who's reared 12 children for the southern market, when I remember that when she became too much racked with pain and old age, she was turned out literally to die with none to look after her, and the institutions of this country, church and state, sanctioning and sanctifying this crime, I have no words of eulogy. I have no patriotism. How can I love a country when the blood of my blood, the flesh of my flesh, is making fat the soil of America? America's soil is stained red with the blood of black women's shrinking flesh. No, I make no pretension to patriotism. So long as my voice can be heard on this or the other side of the Atlantic, I will hold up this country to the righteous indignation of moral scorn. And in so doing, sir, I will consider myself discharging the true duty of a patriot. Well, as it is with the parent to the child, so with the citizen to the country. For he is a true lover of his native land who rebukes and does not excuse its crimes. And on this matter, sir, I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I will not excuse, I will not retreat one single inch. Thus was my comparison between the American and their cousins in Great Britain in terms of how they saw life. So I understood that once the British people understood what the true reason for this war, that this was no war for attrition, this was no war for conquest, but this was a war to uphold the best principles of our democracy, they would understand and react in due course. They did. However, as the war progressed, about a year later, the president himself called me to his office. I walked in and found him in a greatly agitated state. I said, well, the planter classes have ways of keeping information from the slave classes. In fact, most of them probably have never heard of your Emancipation Proclamation. He said, I know, and that's where you come in. And he began to outline just the rough steps of this plan that he thought about. And as he told me that, my mind started to go in every which way direction. You know how it is that you don't know if you live in a dream or a nightmare. I began to understand that the very action that my dear friend John Brown had been hanging about, the commander-in-chief was wanting me to do, and go deep into Southern territory and to cause an insurrection behind Southern lines. And I thought back that last conversation that I heard and had with John Brown in Chalmers before the raid. And I said to him, no, John. I like the idea of running slaves into the mountains, Captain Brown. If properly executed, it just might work. Especially with your keen awareness that a squad of slaves could indeed hold off an army once they had secured the stronghold. But I must take issue with your initial step, John. I don't believe that Harper's Ferry should serve as the beginning point. A most committed gentleman, John Brown, while in color a white man, yet in sympathy a black, and as deeply committed to our struggle as though his own soul had been pierced with the hot iron of slavery. No, come on now, come on. No, I was just out here talking to myself. No, not as a complete change. It's just that as I began to move outside the orbit of the Massachusetts abolitionists, my reliance on peaceful means to overthrow slavery is getting weaker by the moment. And he moved down the Mississippi, conquered Vicksburg, all the way down to New Orleans, separating the Southern forces from East and West, and eventually they sued for peace. And just as I had really just tested the president's first inaugural, I made it a point to make sure I was at his second inaugural. And I was there with a lady friend of mine, and the president was up on the stand, and you can get a glimpse into a person's soul. For instance, I was standing there, and I was sort of looking up, and then looking at my friend, and the president looked over and saw me standing there, and he pointed me out to his vice president. And the president and vice president looked up, and when he saw who he was talking to him, this scowl came over his face, and he looked to see that I was looking, and all of a sudden it became a smile, but too late. And I said to my friend, I do not know who this man, Andrew Johnson, is, but he is no friend of our people. Well, we decided that we would make our way to the executive mansion, to the receiving line. This had never been done by colored folks. And as we got in, we saw the president standing there, head and shoulders above all else. And he looked up and saw me, and as I approached, he said, "Oh, my friend Frederick Douglass." And he said, "I saw you in the assembled masses this afternoon. What did you think about my speech?" I said, "Mr. President, you have hundreds of people wanting to shake your hand. You don't have time to hear my critique of your speech." He said, No, there's no opinion I value more than my friend Frederick Douglass. What did you think about my speech?" I said, "It was a sacred effort, Mr. President." He said, "Well, I'm glad you approved." And I left. A week or two later, I got a note from the president asking me to join him for tea at the Soldiers Club. This Soldiers' Home was a retreat outside of Washington City that he would go and sort of collect his thoughts. I had a speech already planned, and I've always made a policy never to cancel a speech. And how many times since that day had I wished that I had disappointed that audience and kept that meeting with the president. Well, it was about 2 or 3 weeks after the assassination. I was on my way to the house in Rochester, and I noticed there was a note and a package there. And I opened it, and it was a note from Mrs. Lincoln. And she said that the president considered you not only as an ally, but as a friend. And I know he would want you to have something personal to remember him by. And she gave me his favorite walking cane, and it still stands in my library. I think you understand what I meant and why I say that the Republican Party is the stick. All else nearly the open sea. I say that for 3 reasons. The Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army, the 15th Amendment, the U.S. Constitution, and each of these milestones can be embodied in the life, the memory, the legacy of the late President Abraham Lincoln. I want to thank you.
Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895, was the preeminent major black spokesperson of the 19th century.
Main reason I advocate reconciliation because it seems that the alternative is permanent war. And for me, that's just simply madness. But a reconciliation as a principled act and not as a sellout. You know, we always thought that the reconciliation, reconstruction would be an abolitionist vision. Question, yes, ma'am.
What was the hardest part of being a slave, and what was the best thing about being a free man?
Hardest part of being a slave and the best thing about being a free man. It changed. When I was a little boy, the hard part came when I was I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. Don't really know when I was born. We sort of computed time and planning time and, harvest time. But growing up with the little white boys in the area, I didn't know that I was a slave. And we saw no difference between us. We played together, we had fun together, we ran the hills together. But on about 6 or 7 years, white man would take his son aside and indoctrinate him into what it means to be white. He would indoctrinate us in what it means to be black. And those were two separate things. And when I realized that, that was a hard thing. When my grandmother took us at 12 Mile to the Great Farm, and she separated us, and she said, "Fred, this is your cousin, and this is your sister, and this is your brother." And I looked around, and 2 hours later, one of my just found out brothers said to me, Fred, Grandma gone, Grandma gone.
He was a slave, born an enslaved black man, escaped to freedom in 1838.
The thing about being free was that as a man, I now had control over my own labor. When I escaped to New Bedford, my wife and I were married, walking the streets. We passed a Unitarian church, and the minister's wife came out, asked me if I would chop wood. I said, indeed, I did. And she rewarded me with a 50-cent piece. First time I had free money. And that was the glorious thing, that I had control over labor. And the labor that I put in, I and my family could reap the rewards. So it was a series of changes, but mainly it was control over oneself.
Joined in 1841 with William Lord Garrison and the American Abolitionist Society. Published his first narrative in 1845 and went to England, toured the British Isles back in 47.
Well, I can give you the very words Mr. Hughes said about that. She was quite proud of her charge. And she said, Hugh, Frederick can read. He said, what? Said, Frederick can read. At that moment, all heck broke loose in the household. He said, woman, not only is that immoral, it's illegal. His very words that if you teach a nigger how to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. He said, learning will spoil the best nigger in the world. At that moment, I understood how the white man had control over the black man. It was a matter of control over his mind. And I was determined to learn how to read.
Left his then home in Lynn, Massachusetts, moved to Rochester, New York, opened up his own newspaper, first the North Star, later changed to Frederick Douglass's paper. And then he was an editor and he was a journalist.
I was just wondering how that impacted him, and I have a little bit of knowledge that sometimes the South would twist scripture and use that to oppress people. So how did this man come about with his convictions from scripture, his interpretation, and how did that help him along the way?
Good question, very good question. 1830s in the South, particularly, well, Douglass was a Methodist, and he did an analysis in years later about how the church changed. And he talked about the General Convention of the Methodist Church in 1897 was unquestionably anti-slavery. But as we move through time and the established church becomes less popular and the outside church becomes more popular, then people change.
It's an interesting dichotomy to look at a man as he is ascending, as the people that he championed and loved so well are being terrorized. But that's the dichotomy that one does when one does drama. Drama, as you know, is about conflict. You got a major character that has a major dramatic question, a major problem, and when that character's intention conflicts with that problem, you have conflict and you have drama, and at the end, hopefully, that conflict is resolved. That's the arc of the character.